Hello, that was a section from 3 dances from Iphigenia, which comprises the orchestral interludes from my opera Iphigenia in Weimar. I've come to the Kurpark in Bad Berka. The town dates back to the 12th century and was acquired by the Duchy of Saxe-Weimar in the 17th century at the time of the persecution of witches. There's something of a sordid history here. But the town is better known for Duke Karl August's instigation of a sulphur facility here in 1813. The following year, Goethe was here with a local girls' school teacher, Heinrich Friedrich Schütz, supporting the construction of a spa, which lent itself to the town's name. The park is a lovely spot for quiet contemplation, and I'd like to further consider issues pertaining to modal operators and ontological commitment. Indeed, before continuing further with matters pertaining to alethic modality, including matters of necessity and possibility, it's important to be clear that there are different ways of interpreting the semantics of a modal operator. In a previous episode, I alluded to the difference between nomic and metaphysical necessity as it pertains to the mind-body problem. Indeed, an operator that is modal in natural terms, if the logical positivist will allow for such a thing, is going to act differently to an operator that is modal in metaphysical, or normative, or deontic, or even logical terms. Sometimes the boundaries between these types are blurred, and there's no independent mechanism for clarifying distinctions besides the application of best reason. Here's an example. The proposition a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony might be underway somewhere in the world right now can have more than one meaning according to context. In terms of nomic possibility, the laws of science allow for the possibility that a performance might be underway. Performances of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony do exist in the world, and there are no physicalist impediments to cast doubt that there could be one underway right now. In terms of epistemic possibility, my seeing an online announcement of a concert scheduled for right now allows for me knowing the possibility it might be underway. In terms of metaphysical possibility, I can conceive a situation where a performance might be underway. In this case, the nomic and metaphysical attributions overlap, but here's another situation where they don't. If science assigns ontological commitment to the fact established empirically that physical matter comprises electrons by necessity, then this is a nomic attribution. However, to suggest the knowledge of this fact is fallible will be to assign it the status of epistemological possibility while retaining that of nomic necessity. Alternatively, if the law of the land assigns ontological commitment to the convention of money by requiring payments for various entities by necessity, then this is a normative attribution. However, to suggest that money exists as an actual entity, given it has obvious causal impact upon the world, is to assign it a metaphysical status. Furthermore, if a religious truth assigns ontological commitment to the acts of a deity made by necessity, then this is also a metaphysical attribution. However, in this case, given it has obvious causal impact upon people's behaviour, the attribution might also be a deontic one, but it would not be a nomic one, given the deity cannot be demonstrated empirically or theorised in natural terms. These differences can quickly become complex, but possible world semantics provides a method of defining the meaning of ontological commitment made by way of modal attributions. For instance, if I say that it's impossible for a spaceship to travel faster than the speed of light, whereby this is outlining a nomic necessity, given science has established it's not possible for anything to travel faster than the speed of light, I could also speculate that it might have been possible to travel faster than the speed of light if the laws of nature had been different. This modal attribution of counterfactuality is not a nomic possibility, but it's a metaphysical possibility. There is a possible world where the laws of nature are different to those in the actual world, whereby an object can travel faster than the speed of light. Consequently, it is possible that P expresses the existence of a metaphysical modality applied to our world, the fact that it is metaphysically possible that P. According to possible world semantics, it is true that P is necessary in a particular possible world if it's also true in every world that is accessible to P. It's possible in a particular possible world if it's true in at least one world that's accessible to P. Consequently, possibility depends upon matters of accessibility between worlds, and logical, nomic and metaphysical modalities provide different forms of accessibility. But for now, it's enough to say, according to possible world semantics, it is true that the gods demand the sacrifice of Iphigenia is necessary in a particular possible world if it's also true in every world that's accessible to the notion that the gods demand the sacrifice of Iphigenia. I can also say it is true that Iphigenia objects to being sacrificed is possible in a particular possible world if it's true in at least one world that is accessible to the notion that Iphigenia objects to being sacrificed. I've expressed these propositions separately, but their subjection to modal operators links them. Indeed, possibility and necessity are logically interdependent. If a particular proposition is necessary, then it's not possible that it's not true. If a particular proposition is merely possible, then it's not necessary that it's true. In this case, the propositions form a single notion that, as I hope to show in the remaining episodes of my inquiry, reveals the link between mind and nature as outlined by the Weimar identity thesis. I need to explore further how modal propositions are interpreted by way of a set of hypothetical possible worlds, and that possible worlds semantics provides a method for defining the meaning of ontological commitment. Indeed, the term hypothetical is only a placeholder for what a possible world might be. Kripke's possible world semantics has been prevalent for the past 50 years, but there are other approaches too. The definition of a modal proposition lies in the fact that it cannot be experienced empirically. The proposition, the music is loud, is something that can be experienced and validated as true by an observer, but the proposition, the music could have been quiet, refers to something that can be conceived but that cannot be verified by experience. If we use possible world semantics to describe the meaning of the proposition, whereby there is an alternative world to the actual world in which the music was actually quiet, then is this possible world merely a fiction? Is it an induction based on empirical evidence? Is it a deduction based on logical reason, or something else? The theory of fictionalism argues that modalities are mere fictions. It is possible that P is true if and only if there is a collection of stories such that, according to at least one of them, P is true. They are stories equivalent to the myth of Iphigenia. If I say a performance of my opera Iphigenia in Weimar could be underway right now, then I'm not proposing an extant entity. I'm telling a kind of story, and there's no implication that there's anything real or actual about the story. If I posit a possible world whereby mind is not reducible to matter, then this is another kind of story. There's no disputing it's a metaphysical theory, but fictionalism argues that ontologically it's little different to that of a fairy tale. This is a common sense approach to modality as defined by convention. However, there are problems with interpreting possible worlds as a mere collection of stories. It's not clear whether the theory of fictionalism itself is to be taken as literally true, or whether it too is a fiction. If it's to be taken as an actual theory, as literally true, then the entity "there is a world where possible worlds are a fiction" is not necessarily a fiction. It could also be literally true, which is a contradiction. And on the other hand, if the entity of possible worlds fiction is necessarily a fiction itself, and true in all possible worlds, then it's not a fiction, as necessary entities are by definition extant, which is also a contradiction. This is a similar argument to that used when applying relativism to itself, or in the case of music practice rooms, including the list of all lists on the list of all lists. But in this case, the problem is caused by the fact that fictionalism doesn't account for whether the actual world is also fiction. Unfortunately, there's no simple solution to this problem. If fictionalism were to take an anti-realist stance and offer no ontological commitment to anything, to attribute fictionalism to everything, then it would possess no efficacy as regards the semantics of possible worlds. The prima facie implication of abandoning a fictionalist account might be to adopt a realist account. Modal realism asserts that all possible worlds, as defined by possible world semantics, are as real as the actual world. If there's an actual world where Iphigenia is not being performed, then there's an alternative actual world where it is. The leading exponent of this view has been David Lewis, who is a student of Quine alongside Kripke. In articles written over a 20-year period and culminating in his On the Plurality of Worlds, written in 1986, and in contrast to the idea of possible worlds as hypothetical, as proposed by Kripke, Lewis argued that the entities that are possible worlds exist in the same way that the actual world does. It is possible that P is true if and only if P exists as an actual entity in at least one possible world is true. Andrea Borghini wrote, "To Lewis, possible scenarios and the possible entities they involve exist in exactly the same sense that we would say that you and I, the Amazonian forest, and the Eiffel Tower exist." However, I should add that Lewis did not argue that this implied people existed in an infinity of worlds encompassing all possible situations. He proposed what he called counterparts theory, which is an alternative to possible world semantics, and which asserts no individual exists in more than one world, and furthermore, all of the worlds are separated from one another. Properties and events, such as opera performances, can occur across worlds according to a system of parenthood, but people don't. If I attend a concert in one world and don't attend in another, these people are not both me. Following on from that, another approach beyond the fictionalist account and the realist account is to treat the whole situation with a touch of scepticism. Radical modal skepticism argues that hypothetical modalities are entities that can never be known by a subject in the way that they know an actual entity. The subject can never be confident of grasping the meaning of these propositions. If I posit that skepticism is based on doubt, on the inability to be confident about something, then I must add that just as there are different forms of modality, so there are different forms of skepticism. Ontological skepticism doubts the existence of entities, whereas epistemic skepticism pertains to doubt as regards a subject knowing something. Academic skepticism is a popular form of epistemic skepticism. It argues that for any particular claim, including this one, it's not possible to either affirm or deny the claim, and neither is it possible to affirm or deny the act of affirming or denying the claim. Indeed, it's not possible to even affirm a claim of academic skepticism, because then there will be a particular claim being affirmed, which is not acceptable. One of the greatest skeptics about the semantics of modality was somebody I've mentioned several times previously, Willard Quine. His was not an academic skepticism, or the kind of skepticism I discussed in episode 25, based upon the inability of other arguments to avoid fallibility. He was determined to justify his skepticism. He pointed out that modalities do not apply in the same way to different types of situations, and he argued that modalities used as adverbs fail to define a tangible context. Let me explain. A de dicto proposition says something about another sentence without modifying that sentence. The modal proposition, "it is possible that Iphigenia objects to being sacrificed," has two separate parts. Firstly, that Iphigenia objects to being sacrificed, and secondly, a comment about the first, an enunciative operator, but which does not change the meaning of the first. In one case, Iphigenia objects, in another case, she doesn't. It's as if the choice between the two is made by an external narrator. In contrast, a de re proposition uses a sentence to modify other sentences. The modal proposition, "possibly Iphigenia resolves to being sacrificed," or in other words, Iphigenia possibly objects to being sacrificed, remains a single statement, but with a changed meaning. The term possibly is, in this case, an adverb. Iphigenia, the subject, might object and she might not. In this case, the choice between the two is not made by a narrator, but by Iphigenia. Quine said that it's fine to treat de dicto propositions, the first kind, in modal terms because the modality is clear. They're metalinguistic. They reveal an attitude to the target sentence which can incorporate modality. However, he argues that de re propositions, the kind preferred by most of those interested in modality, do not possess a clear modality. He argued that necessity and possibility exist only in people's attitudes towards things, not in the things themselves. Modality is fine as an epistemological tool characterizing what we know, but not as a metaphysical tool. Consequently, he rejected the whole idea of possible world semantics. Besides Quine, there have been others sceptical about modal arguments, and for additional reasons too. In particular, there's been a lot of ridicule hoisted on the kind of modal syllogisms that have characterized the history of metaphysics. Here are two examples. If it is possible that there is a being that comprises all perfections, and it is necessary that existence is a perfection, then there is a perfect being. Here's another example. Given the thesis, if there exists an omniscient, omnipotent and morally perfect being, then there cannot also exist much suffering without explanation, and it is possible that there exists much suffering without explanation, then it is not necessary that there exists an omniscient, omnipotent and morally perfect being. These kinds of arguments might have worked for the scholastics or the early modern era, but in more recent times they've been seen to be questionable at best because they're based on what is merely conceivable by the imagination rather than what exists in the actual world. It's said that conceivability is not sufficient grounds to justify possibility, that there are many possible scenarios which are contradictions or completely inconceivable. It's said that, at the bottom line, the truth of something hypothetical that is merely conceivable can never be established, although it's my intent to challenge this. To do this, I've come back to the Ilm River, in a small village just south of Weimar. This is a beautiful village of Burgfahrt. There's a most beautiful covered bridge here, built more than 400 years ago. The Three Towers trail runs nearby, heading from the Belvedere Palace to Bad Berka, and there are some remarkable cliffs surrounding the village too. The landscape is very characteristic of the foothills region between Weimar and the Thuringian forest. In a sense, having set out an anti-realist starting point at the beginning of this inquiry, I should have great empathy with these arguments, given they seek to deny ontological commitment to modal entities. However, it makes no sense to me to be a skeptic towards those entities that are encompassed by modal attributes, and not towards those that are not. Indeed, these arguments are easily refuted by pointing out that there are some things in the universe which are comprehensible without the aid of direct experience. Rather than assume that knowledge requires empirical a posteriori justification, the subject can take a leaf from Kant and look for justification by way of the synthetic a priori. This approach can offer validity in the way that's independent of experience. For instance, if I know that my best friend's two siblings are male, it could be because I've met them, or it could be because my best friend has told me he has two brothers. In the case of the latter, I can deduce they're male. Being male is included in the definition of being a brother, and so this deduction is a priori. Similarly, if I know that the music could have been quiet, and it's because the music is being played through an amplifier with an extant volume control, then the fact that the music could have been quiet is a deduction based upon these other facts. This is a kind of metaphysical scepticism, whereby only one world is considered to exist as an actuality, the real world, but there's an infinite number of possible worlds which are alternatives or substitutes. Possible world semantics refutes the arguments of Quine and other modal skeptics. It seeks to define modalities of the world as it exists, not just in people's attitudes to the world. It extends the metaphysical question of what is the entity that exists when it is the case that P, and asks, what is the entity that exists when it is the case that possibly P, or necessarily P? Combinatorialism posits that any possible world is an abstract recombination of the components found in the actual world, those things that are known empirically of the actual world. Despite being independent of experience, these entities, given they're derived from empirical constituents, are given a form of substitute actuality. It is possible that P is true if and only if P is obtained by means of a legitimate recombination of constituents of at least one actual state of affairs. So, the counterfactual statement, I might have eaten an apple rather than a banana, is a possible world according to combinatorialism because all of its components, including the apple that I might have eaten, are a part of the actual world. My possibly having eaten an apple is a hypothetical world, but it's given legitimate counterfactual status by the fact it actually could have happened. It's my impression that the tradition of writers of modality, extending through Leibniz, Wittgenstein in his Tractatus, Carnap, Kripke, and to the modern day, are more interested in treating possible worlds as hypothetical entities within the constraints of combinatorialism. Although, interestingly, the metaphysics of this approach can be seen to reject nominalism, the argument that only particulars exist. Given that it's assigning a real existence to hypothetical entities, those that meet its combinatorial criteria, it can be regarded as a modern version of the realist metaphysics of the scholastics 1,000 years ago, and thereafter traced back to Plato. I'll finish with another section from Three Dances from Iphigenia. Thanks for listening. I hope you can join me again for the last 2 episodes of my inquiry.